November 8th, 2014. The first 5 episodes of Naked Mormonism went public after dozens of hours of scripting, producing, building, trial and error, and, of course, a tiny bit of luck. 3.5 years have passed since that time, and a lot has changed. The show has grown and adapted to become what it is today. When this endeavor began, like a lot of Mormons when they intellectually leave the church, I was angry. I felt betrayed by the church and what it taught as unquestionable truths, but this anger came from being lied to by the institution itself, not because of any bad actors within it. And this podcast has been cathartic. It's provided a way to gain a deeper appreciation for all those involved with Mormonism from its inception. In our historical timeline, we've followed Joseph Smith from his earliest years, through publishing the Book of Mormon, making friends and enemies, being tarred and feathered and nearly castrated. We watched Joseph construct multiple empires before his actions inevitably resulted in his removal from entire communities and states. We've seen him arrested and followed his court proceedings multiple times, once for possibly telling his death squad to go kill a wealthy businessman. We've seen him try to solve his debts by going treasure digging with trusted Mormon elites in Massachusetts. We've watched him lead an army to eventual surrender and dissolution in Missouri, and we've languished with him in prison. We've seen Joe form and dissolve dozens of important relationships and businesses. We've followed Joe's sexual indiscretions and the resulting fallout from his poor decision-making to satiate his carnal desires. We've read propaganda and anti-Mormon literature from dozens of contemporary sources in order to garner a richer understanding of how Joe and the Mormons were publicly viewed as anything from heretics to deluded fanatics to saints of God. We've picked every low-hanging fruit of Mormon history, and we've climbed a few branches to get, some of those sweeter bits at the higher levels, but there's much left behind that we haven't explored and may never explore. Ahead of us lies only a few more low-hanging morsels of which to partake: the Book of Abraham, the Kinderhook plates, and the Nauvoo expositor leading to Joe's demise. And we'll give all these points and all the necessary context surrounding them their proper treatment in due time. All that said, we've come a long way in 3.5 years and 100 episodes of podcasting. It's actually been over 165 episodes, but the point still stands. And I've said since the beginning that I do this podcast for myself. I do it if nobody listens. I'll be doing it during the impending economic recession that lies in the horizon. But this podcast isn't just another audio platform lost to the annals of cyberspace. You, the listeners, have been the driving force behind it all. It's because of you that this show has become whatever it is today. It's because of every one of you that this show has reached as many people as it has. And a crucial part of this whole equation, it's all because of every one of you that I'm able to spend 80 to 90 hours a week researching and creating content instead of 40 hours a week at a dead-end job that I hate. And I can't help but think that I'm one heck of a lucky guy to find myself in that tiny percentage of people who makes their living from doing their passion. What started as a hobby and therapeutic outlet has become a full-time research and writing endeavor and a handful of public presentations at various groups and conferences, and that's all because of every one of you. I simply can't express to you how grateful I am that each and every one of you have been willing to support me through this endeavor for so long. Your support, whether moral or financial, or just by clicking the download button every week, it means the world to me. Yes, I'll be doing this podcast and research regardless of how many people consume it, but it's because of you that I'm able to take pride in this work, and it's because of you that I actually feel rewarded for the efforts. So, as you've come to characteristically expect from yours truly by now, that's my belabored way of saying thank you. Thank you for everything. Here's to the next 100.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. If Joseph Smith co-opted Masonic rituals, should that cause a person to question their faith in Joseph's restored gospel? The similarities between Masonic ascendancy rituals and the Mormon temple ceremonies have been a source of fascination and occasional conflict among Mormon historians and everyday chapel-attending Mormons for well over a century and a half. When examined in isolation, Mormon temple ceremonies are esoteric and symbolic of covenants that Mormons make with their God and religion regularly throughout their lives. This ritual is unique when compared to Mormonism's Christian counterparts. Mormonism has a step above and beyond the symbolism and rituals of most other Christianities. On the other hand, Freemasonry is a non-religious organization. It doesn't claim to hold the secret rituals necessary to get a person to heaven. It merely exists to make good men better. Masonry isn't a secretive organization. Anybody can go to their local Masonic lodge or temple and strike up a conversation. You can find any information that you want to know about Masonry online through a wealth of information provided by Masons. But to examine Mormonism apart from Masonry does a great disservice to Joseph Smith and the impact of Masonry on American and Mormon history. Some of you listening to this right now may know how deep these connections go, but to others, this episode will hopefully be a sufficient introduction once we understand how deeply intertwined Joseph Smith was with Freemasonry. So let me preface our deep dive of Mormonism and Masonry today with a few precursors. First off, the format for today is a little different than usual. This will be a very long episode, and the material is particularly dense this week, even though we're only scratching the surface. I'd like to eventually spend 7.5 hours on Mormonism and Masonry like we did with the Book of Mormon, and if I've learned anything from the download numbers, it's that you guys enjoy these long-form deep dives the very most. When we get lost in the weeds, that's when we have the most fun. We'll be periodically joined by Mormon historian Cheryl Bruno to help us walk through this subject. Cheryl's been writing on Mormon history for a long time on her Worlds Without End blog, and she's been studying Mormon history for decades, and she's gearing up to release a book on Mormon Masonry in Nauvoo in the relatively near future, and she was nice enough to share some of her research with us. Those of you who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you guys got the full uncut interview on Monday as a bit of a sneak peek for this week's show. Second precursor. I'm not a Mason, and I left Mormonism before ever going through the temple. I hold no reverence or sanctity for either organization or their secret rituals. I've never sworn oaths of secrecy or fealty to either organization, and I don't expect to do so anytime soon, being an atheist. When we go through the sacred rituals comparatively, some people may be offended. This information needs to be out there, and it can't be ignored when talking about these intersecting topics. We'll probably never have a Mason on the show after this episode, but that's an understandable consequence when the white-hot light of scrutiny in a public forum is aimed at any inherently secretive organization. A few points to keep in mind during this analysis. Not being a Mason, an active Mormon, and only having studied the history of one of these organizations for a few years, I am woefully under-researched to do this subject proper justice. Historians have devoted their entire life's work to understanding the intersection between these two organizations, and apparently the scant few books out there on the subject leave a lot to be desired. We're going to glaze over or wholly miss details that an entered apprentice or an amateur Mormon historian would know on their first day at Masonic Lodge or at BYU Religious Studies, respectively. I'll inevitably draw a number of inaccurate comparisons, and I'll do my best to not make any false conclusions. Whether out of need for conciseness or just sheer ignorance, some important details are going to be missed in our analysis. And we're coming at this from an outsider's perspective on both fronts, and I sincerely hope that any Mason or any Mormon historian listeners out there will grant a little bit of wiggle room with how I present this information that I've researched thus far. Third precursor. It's truly a challenge to research Masonry without falling down the rabbit hole of Zionist New World Order conspiracy. Masonry and Mormonism are both secretive organizations at some level, and many of their members wield a fair amount of wealth and power, making both organizations a magnet for tinfoil hat conspiracy hypotheses. I don't say conspiracy theories because these claims don't pass any level of theoretical scrutiny and mostly rely on ascribing causation when tenuous correlation is all which really exists. Most conspiracy hypotheses require dropping big names and then showing pictures of those big named people in the same room at the same time and then jumping to radical conclusions that of course, obviously the people are in league to overthrow the world and cling to power at all costs. These conspiracy hypotheses are rightfully laughed at by Masons and Mormons alike, and any New World Order talk is just ignorant anti-Mason or anti-Mormon propaganda, and we won't degrade this presentation by entertaining this field of pseudo-history. It has no place here. For our purposes, it may be best to view Masonry as a get-together of men sharing knowledge and drinking a lot. We have Meetup and Facebook today to connect like-minded individuals, but that's a luxury only recently afforded to humanity. In a time with no internet and extremely low literacy rates, people seeking higher education often relied on Masonry or other similar informal gatherings to gain new skills and knowledge. Masonry is a boys' club comprised of all people of all religious faiths and cultures. Similar groups of boys' clubs have grown out of Masonry, and other groups like it existed long before Masonry ever made its debut into the historical record. Let's go ahead and get into it. The Smith family had connections to Masonry before Joseph Smith was even born. Masonry had a powerful infusion into American society and politics throughout the entire 18th century. But before we get to the end of the 18th century and beginning of 19th century where the Smith family comes in, we need to go way back to get some context on what Masonry is and how it came to be. It's well understood that Freemasonry began as a fraternal organization of wandering stonemasons. Let's go through an insultingly brief history of Masonry to put Masonry and Mormonism into context here. Freemasonry could be considered an early unionized workforce, if we're really loose with our definitions here. Stonemasonry was a respected and fairly unique craft. Most craftsmen, like carpenters or blacksmiths, professions like that, they set up their shop in an area and then people would patronize their shop. But Masonry is different. Masons go wherever the work is. A wealthy person in a village may have needed a mason for a few months or a few years of work in order to build a building or a monument or something like that. Then once the project was completed, there's no more work for the mason to perform, and they had to move on to the next town where there might be work. Masonry is a highly skilled trade, and the degrees of a mason determine that man's ability to perform certain tasks. Out of the necessity to convey your level of expertise efficiently, specific handshakes and passwords along with a hierarchy eventually evolved. These eventually became codified and have changed as time and distance has separated different groups of Masonry. The first unquestionably Masonic writing available to historians is known as the Regis poem in ye olde English, dated from the year of our Lord 1390. It's a poem with the subtitle of, quote, "Here begins the constitutions of the art of geometry according to Euclid," end quote. And when translated, that's just when it's translated into modern English. Of course, when it says geometry, that's not geometry that we learn in middle school. This is geometry in the sense it is used in the Latin and Greek roots of geo meaning earth and metry meaning to measure. So the etymology of geometry means to literally measure earth. So when you see the G in the center of the Masonic symbol, geometry is what it stands for, measuring earth. The Regis poem ends with this quite interesting passage. Quote, "When thou meetest a worthy man, cap and hood thou hold not on, in church, in market, or in the gate, do him reverence after his state. If thou goest with a worthier man, than thyself thou art one. Let thy foremost shoulder follow his back, for that is nurture without lack. When he doth speak, hold thee still. When he hath done, say for thy will. In thy speech, that thou be discreet, and what thou sayest consider thee well. But deprive thou not him his tale, neither at the wine, nor at the ale. Christ then of his high grace save you both wit and space. Well this book to know and read, heaven to have for your reward. Amen, amen, so mote it be. So say we all for charity." End quote. Masonry continued to exist in obscure forms and writings throughout the short remainder of the medieval period until the Enlightenment. The Black Plague caused a shortage of laborers and drove up construction costs for projects requiring masonry. 1425 was the first time that a king outlawed Masons being able to meet in order to essentially unionize and jack up their labor prices. This group of Masons responded by claiming that a king from around 900 CE gave them permission to meet and essentially unionize. Similar scenarios evolved the claims of Masonry's genesis to earlier and earlier times, eventually leading to Masons claiming that they had the same rituals as practiced in Solomon's temple, and even before that to the Egyptian paganistic rituals. In 1660, the Royal Society was founded, drawing on the inspiration of great philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. After that, 4 lodges were installed in London in 1717 to form the first official Masonic Grand Lodge of England. After the foundation of that lodge, Masonry began an age of popularization, and thus spread throughout all of Europe and into the American colonies. The first official American Masonic Lodge was formed in 1731 in Pennsylvania. Many of the Founding Fathers were Masons, as were a number of the Enlightenment philosophers from whom the Founding Fathers drew their inspiration. Here's a quick list of names to exhibit how prevalent and influential Masons have been in America. William Ellery was likely a Mason. He also supported the abolition of slavery in 1785 and stopped it from being spread further into the northern states. We have Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, William Whipple, to name a few. Paul Revere, although he's not considered a founding father specifically, Paul Revere definitely was influential. And it was actually reported that Paul Revere's ride was only possible because he was imprisoned at the time by a fellow Mason who released Revere when he learned that Revere was also a Mason. Also, 14 of the U.S. presidents to date have been Masons. That's George Washington, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, James Polk, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, James Garfield, William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, Warren Harding, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Gerald Ford. 9 of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence were Masons. Some of the Enlightenment philosophers who were Masons were Voltaire, Isaac Newton, John Locke, and there is some evidence to suggest that Francis Bacon was a Mason as well. Even Mozart was a Mason. And then Frederick Bartholdi, the guy who designed the Statue of Liberty and laid the cornerstone for it, he was a Mason. Even Buzz Aldrin is a Mason. Masonry has served as the glue among early American religions, politicians, and social movements. When a person wanted to accomplish something, they leveraged relationships gained through Masonry. With no federal religion in America and so many sects bickering about who is following the one true religion, Masonry is specifically non-religious. So when a state building needed the cornerstones laid or it needed to be dedicated after construction, it was often Masons doing it because they weren't from any specific religion, but they still believed in God. Government authorities didn't really want to show favoritism towards any specific religion, so they went with a non-religious sect. This had the impact of Masons being tied to nearly every major government project in some way, while not creating a landscape where one religion was favored over the other. America wanted to avoid religious wars, which had torn down so many empires throughout history, which is why we have the separation of church and state. Masonry was the common language which satisfied the needs of the God-fearing, and it united all religious sects together by paying homage to exactly none of them. The argument follows that because Masonry has been so deeply intertwined with the foundations of the country, that much of the good that we see in society and a lot of the public infrastructure only exists today because of Masonry at this country's foundation. Now, people are quick to ascribe unfounded malice to any secretive organization, but they're quick to ignore all of the incredible good which has come from it. Many politicians since the foundation of this country have been Masons or have had friends who were Masons. Masonic lodges are a great place to meet people and share ideas and viewpoints a person otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. This has led to overrepresentation of Masons in politics, particularly during the foundation of the United States. Prior to the 20th century, Masons rarely, if ever, crested above 10% of the population, but 16% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons, and Masons continued to wax influential in American politics from that time forward. Some of the more enlightened northern states may have had as high as 40 to 50% of their elected officials as Masons of all religious stripes. Masonry was a cultural meme Joseph Smith could never escape, and it had an incredible influence on his life. One thing I am endlessly fascinated about when it comes to the confluence of Mormonism and Masonry is it's oftentimes used as, oh, well, the church ceremony or the temple ceremonies, they're exactly patterned after Masonry. And, Joseph was a master Mason when he brought the ceremonies forward. And what I find more fascinating about this is it runs a lot deeper than just what happened in Nauvoo when it comes to Masonic connections to the Joseph Smith family prior to the Book of Mormon, when it comes to allusions to Masonry in the Book of Mormon itself, and a number of the earliest members were Masons themselves. So while it is often used as something to cast a really broad net over a chunk of church history, I think it's important to dive into the minutia quite a bit and try and analyze these pieces on more of a continuum. So I wonder if we could go ahead and get started on where Joseph kind of was initially introduced to Masonry, his familial connections with early Mason, prior to Book of Mormon Masonry, and then kind of how Masonry finds itself woven into the subject matter within the Book of Mormon at various times.
Yes.
What do you make of all of that?
That is a great place to start. Nick Latursky likes to say that Joseph Smith was involved in Masonry from the cradle to the grave. And that's quite true because his doctor who delivered him, Dr. Joseph Dennison, was a Freemason. So it actually literally began at the cradle. Let's see. Joseph had many members of his family join the Masonic institution. I think the first one I can find is John Curtis Waller was Joseph Smith Sr.'s brother-in-law, and he joined Vermont Federal Lodge in 1801. So that was before Joseph was born. And then we think about the same year, in the end of 1801, Joseph Smith Sr. petitioned that lodge, Vermont Federal Lodge number 15, and his petition was rejected. Now, we can never be quite sure if that was our Joseph Smith because it's such a common name. But
of course,
right, there are many reasons though why Joseph Smith might have been rejected from that lodge, and one was that he had a drinking problem. And Masons at the time did not like that. Even though they would drink, they didn't like you to have a drinking problem. Another was there was a member in the lodge who was also growing ginseng and may have seen Joseph Smith Sr. as a threat to his business. And he was actually later the one who kind of cheated them out of their money. I don't remember names and dates on that one, but yeah, so that may have been a factor, and there's several different factors that could have gone into that. So we believe that Joseph Smith Sr. was the one who petitioned Vermont Federal Lodge in 1801.
Wow. But I mean, it wouldn't be for another, decade and a half before Joseph Sr. was introduced to or was accepted into Masonry. Is that correct?
Right. So they later he moved to New York. And when he had been in New York just over a year, he petitioned Ontario Lodge number 23. And again, we do not know for sure if this was our Joseph Smith, but I'm pretty positive that this is Joseph Smith Sr., who petitioned in November of 1817, because first of all, you couldn't petition a lodge unless you'd been in the area, unless you've lived there for a year. And so isn't that interesting that exactly a year after he's there, he petitions the lodge?
Okay.
And second of all, he was the closest Joseph Smith to that lodge. The others were several miles more away than he was. The Smith family was in Tunbridge, which was about 7 miles away from this New York, Ontario lodge. And about July 1st of that same year, they moved from Tunbridge to Randolph, which is where the seat of that lodge was. So so it seems very, very positive to me that this is our Joseph Smith.
Let's go ahead and jump off there. So as I'm aware, Hiram Smith was also a Mason just a couple of years before the Book of Mormon came along. Is that accurate as well?
Yes. Now we know that Hiram was a member of Mount Moriah Lodge in Canandaigua. He joined the lodge before June 1827 because in June 1827, he was paying dues there at that lodge. And we have evidence that this was our Hiram Smith because later when he's in Nauvoo, he, the lodge minutes say that Hiram hailed from this Mount Moriah Lodge. And there are also other contemporary journal pieces that talk about Hiram being from Mount Moriah Lodge.
Well, and also the frequency of the name coming up, Hiram, is a little bit less common than Joseph Smith, right? So I would assume that there are a few Hiram Smiths living around the area than there were Joseph Smiths.
Yes, probably so. Although Hiram became a very popular name about that time in the United States because Freemasonry was becoming popular. And in Vermont, when Hiram was born, they just had Freemasonry just came into Vermont in a big way just before Hiram was born. And if you look at Nick Latursky has done some studies on the naming of the children to see if this has anything to do with Masonry. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge uptick in the name Hiram right about that time that he was born. So we do believe that Joseph Smith Sr. was naming him Hiram after the Hiram of Masonic.
One aspect of Joseph Smith's history which has yet to be explored through a Masonic lens was his use of a hat to deprive himself of light whilst he was hunting for buried treasure. In 1866, a book was released which has kind of become a standard bearer of mid-19th century Masonry. It was called Duncan's Masonic Ritual and Monitor. The end provides a glossary which may help explain Joseph Smith's mechanism of treasure digging. Under the definition of eyesight, it says, quote, "He who has been temporarily deprived of his sight is reduced to the condition of a newborn babe, or of one of those unfortunate individuals whose natural infirmity renders the presence of a conductor indispensably necessary. But there are no outward objects to distract his attention. It is then that with the eye of reflection he probes into the deepest and darkest recesses of his own heart and discovers his natural imperfections and impurities much more readily than he could possibly have done had he not been deprived of his sight." Essentially, it's just saying it's really important to occasionally meditate in a dark place, and that does make its appearance in the Masonic rituals. This short deprivation of sight has kindled in his heart a spark of the brightest and purest flames. We must further admit that those who have been deprived of their sight, and who have hopes of being restored to it, strive most industriously and diligently to obtain it, that they have no greater desire, and that they will most readily pledge themselves to all that can be required of them in order to obtain that inestimable blessing. A man who has been deprived of his sight may be introduced into places where he is surrounded by the strangest and the rarest objects, without a possibility of his becoming a traitor. At the same time, those who are in possession of their sight cannot feel the care of their guides so much as those who are hoodwinked. Hoodwinked, that's a very powerful Masonic word there. And who feel that without the constant attention of their conductors, they would be much more helpless than they are now. But, however many proofs of attention and care they may receive, there is still something left to wish for. And to the question, what is your chief desire? The answer will assuredly be light. End quote. So that's important. The hoodwinking part of the Masonic ceremony is when the initiate is blindfolded, essentially, as they are brought into the lodge and the initiation ceremony begins. Joseph Smith using his hat with a rock in it in order to create a dark area where he could see the spiritual light may have some roots in Masonry. Another thing to note in all of this is there was a man named Hosea Ballou, who is known as the father of Universalism, and he is also a Mason in good standing as he propagated his doctrine of Universalism throughout early America. Joseph Smith's father and two of his uncles were Universalists and Masons. With uncles Asael Smith and John Smith and father Joseph Smith Sr., that's Big Daddy Cheese, being so wrapped up in Masonry and Universalism and the occult, Joseph Smith was literally surrounded by Masons during his most formative years as a child and teenager. Then something extremely prominent and public occurred right in Joseph Smith's own backyard. Masonry was a big issue during Joseph Smith's early, teenage and, a young adulthood during the time that he was writing the Book of Mormon. And there are some subtle allusions to the to Masonry in the Book of Mormon when it comes to invoking these Gadian robbers with these secret combinations. So I want to get your take on kind of the William Morgan affair, the anti-Masonic fervor in the 1820s with the election of Andrew Jackson as president, as well as some of the allusions that we see in the Book of Mormon to Masonry.
I think as modern people, we just don't understand how strongly Freemasonry was affecting the country at that time. I mean, so many people were Masons, so many people knew about Masonry that just isn't today. It would be like someone who was living in our world that didn't know about Superman, or the backstory of Superman. We all know that as part of our cultural milieu. And that was the same for Joseph Smith. I haven't told you that two of his uncles were also Masons. His cousin was a Mason. So, Masonry was in his family. So, about the age of 21, this big event happened concerning William Morgan, who threatened to expose the Masonic ceremony and wrote this book about it. And he was kidnapped by a group of Masons and taken to Fort Niagara, where he disappeared and was never seen again. And for some reason, the whole country just erupted in this huge furor about Masonry, that Masons were actually enacting, even though they said their ritual was symbolic, that they were actually murdering people that tried to expose the ceremony. And they started to get worried about political influence that Masons had had, even though this had been going on for years. Now they're so upset because Masons are voting for their Masonic friends and they're covering up for their Masonic friends. And so they were worried about Andrew Jackson becoming president because he was a Mason. He ended up being great president, and the fears were not, didn't come to pass in his case. But people just were right about the time, 1826 was when this happened. And this blew up right near Joseph Smith's home. So he would have had to have been deaf and blind not to know what was going on with William Morgan. We have all kinds of evidence that there were troops that went by within like 5 or 10 miles of his house that would perform the Masonic ceremonies so the whole public could see exactly what went on in the lodge. And there are books about it. And yeah, it was entertainment of the day. It was in newspapers everywhere.
The Masons were the Kardashians of Joseph's day.
Of course. They were all over the place. Yeah.
Wow. Historians are unable to determine Morgan's motivations behind writing his expose of 1826. He was a Mason in good standing at the time he wrote it, and it seems as if he wanted to basically write a manual for the ascendancy rituals, but he was denied permission. With respect to that, his book does take some seemingly antagonistic approaches, as most exposés of Masonry do, so it's unclear where his motivations may have been upon writing and publishing the work. Regardless of his motivations, what happened in the wake of his expose is undeniable. A new uprising of anti-Masonic rhetoric entered the public lexicon and was used to smear Andrew Jackson's presidential campaign. The Masons, who allegedly kidnapped Morgan, passed through the Canandaigua Lodge, which was nearest to Palmyra at the time when Hiram Smith had just become an entered apprentice. And of course, we can't forget to mention that William Morgan's widow, Lucinda Morgan Pendleton, became one of Joseph's polygamous wives during the brief year that Joseph spent in Missouri in 1838. There's no possible way for historians to conclude that Joseph Smith was not familiar with the Morgan affair. The introduction to Morgan's expose was written by publisher Colonel David C. Miller, who described what had happened and articulated the necessity of the work in spite of any threats of danger from Masons who were unhappy with the work being published. His introduction reads in part, quote, "In the absence of the author, or rather compiler of the following work, who was kidnapped and carried away from the village of Batavia on the 11th of September, 1826, never forget, by a number of Freemasons, it devolves upon the publisher to attempt to set forth some of the leading views that governed those who embarked in the undertaking. It is not our intentions, however, to give full details of the whims and caprices of men to bring forth the historic records of other years as proof of the windings and shiftings of the various characters who have strutted their brief hour on life stage, in order to convince that the customs, associations, and institutions are like the lives of the authors and abettors, fleeting and fragile. Many of them rise up as bubbles on the ocean and die away. Circumstances give them existence, and when these causes cease to exist, they go into the same gulf of oblivion as countless exploded opinions and tenets have gone before them. The mind that formed and planned them goes on in its dazzling flight, bounding over barrier after barrier till it has arrived at the ultimate goal of consummation." End quote. In the fallout of the William Morgan expose affair, Masonic lodges all over America shut down. Legislation was introduced in multiple states to bar Masons from running for office. The official anti-Masonic political party was organized, igniting nationwide tensions, which took more than a decade to overcome, and some of the vestiges of this anti-Masonic fervor exist to this day. Amidst this public strife and conflict, Joseph Smith was aging into young adulthood and forming the ideas behind his seminal work, the Book of Mormon. And then we do find these allusions to the secret combinations in the Book of Mormon, and you voiced to me your thoughts that possibly it was more of trying to almost denigrate what were like the not true Masons almost, and almost championing the true Masons. And of course, I'm mincing words, and this is a conversation you and I had quite a while ago, so I'm probably misremembering it. But tell us a little bit about your take on the secret combinations in the Book of Mormon.
Okay, well, I think Joseph Smith, there was an author, a Masonic author named Oliver. His last name was Oliver. What was that first name? I can't remember. But he wrote about something called true Masonry and spurious Masonry. And so true Masonry was when they were living the way they were supposed to. Spurious Masonry was when Masonry apostatized, basically, in our Mormon terminology. So when Joseph is writing, if you'll notice in the Book of Mormon, when Joseph is writing about, it's George Oliver, by the way. So when Joseph is writing about Masonry in the Book of Mormon, he is talking about secret combinations that are bad, right? These are Lamanites. These are not the good Nephites. And so he was talking about spurious Masonry. So what I believe is that Joseph Smith's feelings about anti-Masonry remained consistent throughout his life, that he was against spurious Masonry and he was for true Masonry. So when we see him, denigrating secret combinations, that's when he's talking about the Masonry that's gone apostate. And then when he comes into Nauvoo and he forms a lodge, this is him going to restore Masonry, and it's going to be true Masonry.
Fascinating. Joseph Smith was exposed to Masonry just as much as occultism in lieu of a structured public education. An important distinction needs to be made here. Masonry merely provided a place where men could exchange ideas and information with each other. Occultism was merely one of the many fields of expertise the Smith family shared with their fellow occult magicians, some of whom may have been Masons. Masonry is essentially the school. The occult, alchemy, mathematics, herbal medicine, etc., those are the curricula. The people who practiced occult magic often had their motives ascribed to Masonry from outside observers. This is from D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, beginning on page 69. Quote, "In the 18th century, Freemasons also began publishing John Locke's alleged letter commenting on 15th century document, which accused Masons of trying to conceal their ability of, quote, winning the faculty of Abrach, end quote." That's pretty important. We probably won't be getting into it, but the winning the faculty of Abrach, Quinn goes on to describe it a little bit better here. From 1775 to 1840, William Preston's discussion of the faculty of Abrach in his pro-Masonic illustrations of Masonry went through 15 English and 2 American editions. Some late 19th century Masons disavowed both documents as forgeries, yet earlier Freemasons frequently used this alleged medieval document to help establish the antiquity of Masonry. However, Preston's note in the text of Locke's disputed commentary as if it were a note by Locke himself. However, this common Masonic use of the letter obscured the fact that Masons rejected the accusation that they practiced ceremonial magic. Anti-Masonic writers were eager to accept the implications of the Freemasonry magic connection that Masonic writers had unintentionally encouraged with their use of the document's reference to the faculty of a brack. In 1828, New Yorker Henry Dana Ward anonymously published under the pseudonym A Master Mason an influential anti-Masonic expose that made the magic Masonry connection explicit. The first time Ward quoted the phrase, he altered it to read, quote, "the way of winning the faculty of magic," as opposed to a brack, even though he cited as his source an official Masonic publication that used a brack, not magic, end quote. Occult ritualism and Masonic ritualism have different scopes and esoteric meanings, yet they still function in much the same way in practice through physically acting out narratives. And this is something that happens in many types of rituals. People act out passion narratives of stories, biblical stories or otherwise, and then they use those narratives to teach lessons and initiate investigators into their respective schools of philosophy or theology or whatever ology they're working with. It should be noted that these passion narratives can be co-opted and altered by individuals in order to create their own club or their own initiation rite. Masonic ascendancy rituals have changed over time, and they vary by whichever rite the initiate seeks to join. In the same vein, the original temple ceremonies Joseph Smith introduced have significantly changed in subtle ways as they've passed from generation to generation. Once Mormonism was started in 1830, Joseph continued to be influenced by Masons who held prominent leadership roles within the church. Not only does the Book of Mormon pay homage to secret combinations, quote unquote, but Joe's Book of Moses, published in 1832 as a revision of the creation myth, used verbiage which could be ascribed to Cain's association with spurious masonry as a depraved secret combination. However, other historians like Quinn have ascribed the verbiage and phrasing as descending specifically from Kabbalah instead of from Masonry. But just to be understood here, Kabbalah was yet one more school of thought that was taught in Masonic lodges. This is from further on in D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. Quote, "The Book of Mormon and Smith's 1830 Book of Moses both refer to an ancient American organization of murderous black magic. This is more clearly demonstrated by an item of evidence usually used by those who interpret these books as anti-Masonic. The Book of Moses described the origin of the secret combination that plagued the Book of Mormon." Quoting from the Book of Moses, quote, "And Satan said unto Cain, Swear unto me by thy throat, and if thou tell it, thou shalt die. And this day I will deliver thy brother Abel into thine hands. And Satan sware unto Cain that he would do according to his commands. And all these things were done in secret. And Cain said, Truly I am Mahan, the master of this great secret, that I may murder and get gain. Wherefore Cain was called Master Mahan, and he gloried in his wickedness." That is from Moses 5:29 through 31, and verse 51, Helaman 6:27, and Ether 8:15. Now continuing on with D. Michael Quinn. "Proponents of the anti-Masonic interpretation of early Mormon scripture have claimed that this referred to Freemasonry's office of Master Mason." End quote. After that, Quinn goes on to argue that ascribing this language to anti-Masonic rhetoric is spurious, and that the linguistics of the passage seem to lend themselves to Kabbalah Genesis. Now, like I said, it should be noted that Kabbalah was making significant inroads into American culture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, being largely promulgated through communication among Masons interested in unlocking the secrets of the Zohar. Joe's invocation of Kabbalah language is merely one more indicator that he was likely influenced by teachings of fellow Masonic polymaths long before he ever officially joined the Masons in early 1842. Beyond the books of Mormon and Moses, early Mormon hierarchy uses some starkly Masonic language. Beginning in 1830, Joseph organized the hierarchy of the church to be led by himself and Oliver Cowdery as first and second elders of the church, respectively. As the membership grew and various needs evolved out of that growth, more leadership and middle management positions began entering the fray. Joseph Smith introduced the brethren to the idea of the Melchizedek priesthood around 1834 to 35, when many of his closest advisors, who were Masons, had increasing influence on Joe's theology. Around this same time, Joseph introduced the high priesthood quorum and the differentiation between the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthoods, and the story of John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John conferring those priesthoods emerged around this same time. Many of these terms are shared in the Scottish Rite of Masonry, which may exhibit a genetic link between the respective hierarchies. This is from an article on a Masonic website named Traveling Templar, and we find some details of the time and place where this terminology definitively entered the Masonic lexicon. Quote, "The first authenticate record of this order is to be found in the proceedings of the Grand Chapter of Ohio in 1828. Ohio in 1828. And I'm assuming that the first Grand Chapter is probably located in Cleveland, which is a whole 30 miles away from Kirtland, the church headquarters, from 1831 to 37. Interesting. Timing, 1828 of Ohio, and then suddenly 1834, 35, the hierarchy comes out that shares this language with the Scottish Rite. It continues, "The order of high priesthood dates from the year of the blessing of Abraham by the high priest Melchizedek, King Salem. The order's ritual was compiled and arranged by Robert McCoy. In addition, it recommends reading King James Version, Hebrews chapter 7, 1, 5, 17, 20, and 21. And now this is the actual wording of the ritual itself. Quote, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abides a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the 10th of the spoils. And verily, they that are the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes from the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. For he testifies, Thou art a priest forever and after the order of Melchizedek. And inasmuch as not without an oath he was made priest. For those priests, under the Levitical law, were made without an oath, but this with an oath by him that said unto him, The Lord has sworn and will not repent, and thou art a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." End quote. Merely exhibiting similar terminology between this Scottish Rite of Masonry in Ohio of 1828 and Joseph Smith's hierarchy in Kirtland, Ohio in about 1834-35, that doesn't necessarily imply causality. However, the timing and location being so close to Joseph's early ministry in Kirtland, Ohio, that does lend increased viability to that claim. We can't ignore just how surrounded by Masonry Joseph Smith was during his entire ministry. Obviously, there were a number of people who were affiliated with Masonry as, what we might call the Mormon elite, who were closely affiliated with Joseph through the Kirtland years, through the 1 year in Missouri that Joseph spent there, and particularly once he got to Illinois. It seemed like a lot of Masons kind of flocked to his side, John C. Bennett being just one example of a myriad of other Masons that were seeing the uprising of the influx of the Mormon refugees settling in Nauvoo. So I wonder if we could just touch on just some of the names of the members who were Masons that we see as kind of like the movers and shakers during the Nauvoo years.
Well, let's start a little earlier than that. Let's talk about Kirtland, because there were already Masons in Kirtland. And we have in Kirtland, we have Newell K. Whitney, who joined the Masonic Institution in 1819, and he had a store there in Kirtland. And he held the School of the Prophets was held in the upper room of his store in the Kirtland, and this was very similar to how Masons met. They usually met in the upper room of a store or a tavern. And so we think that this is Joseph Smith building this fraternity of the first elders of the church there with Newell K. Whitney. We also have Orson Hyde, who was a Freemason in Kirtland. John Johnson, have you heard of him?
Yeah, he owned the inn in Kirtland as well, and the massive house that's down in Hiram, Ohio, right?
Right. So the interesting thing is his house in Hiram, Ohio has a foundation. The original foundation, you can still go and see this, has a square and compasses etched on the cement of the foundation.
Wow. I wish I would have looked when I saw that.
I know.
That's so cool.
When I was there, I didn't know that either. So I never saw it with my own eyes, but I do have pictures of it. And it is kind of cool that his house was built on a foundation of masonry. So he was also a strong Mason that then moved to Kirtland. And we have Heber C. Kimball, of course. We think that maybe Heber C. Kimball was involved in the Morgan affair because he was a Mason in New York at the time. And we know that the kidnapping Masons took William Morgan through the lodge where Heber C. Kimball was just a young member on their way to Fort Niagara. So he may have, seen that. He may have, held the horse's bits while they went by. We don't know. But he was there. He was in that area. We have, of course, Hiram Smith, who was also in Kirtland. And the other person we have is Warren Cowdery, who was Oliver Cowdery's brother. He became a Mason in 1810, and his whole family, like Joseph Smith's, he had several members of the family who were very active in not only Masonry, but also Royal Arch Masonry.
I'm just really curious. This may be tapping into something you haven't looked into before, but the members of the Nathaniel Wood group, this was in, the late 1790s, where we do have some evidence that Oliver Cowdery's father, as well as Joseph Smith Sr., may have been affiliated with this Nathaniel Wood group. Do we know any notable Masonic connections to members of that Wood group that were, part of this notorious wood scrape, as it was called, before it was disbanded?
Yes, I feel like there is a lot of evidence to show that there was a connection there. And I do have a section I've written in the book talks about that Nathaniel Wood scrape. And not only did the Cowderys have something to do with it, but later accounts talk about Joseph Smith using that wood scrape to build some of his doctrines off of. So you have several, I haven't looked at that in a while, but you do have several accounts that connect Joseph Smith with the wood scrape.
If you're correct in your dating of his 1801 filing to apply to the Vermont Lodge that he was a member of, that would have been just after the Nathaniel Wood group, the Fraternity of Rodsmen, kind of disbanded. And let's also say they disbanded as part of this apocalyptic kind of climax that their group came to, that, if I'm not mistaken, the state militia were called out in order to kind of curtail what was happening.
Right.
But that would have been Joseph Smith Sr. applying to join this Vermont Lodge just maybe 1 or 2 years after the wood scrape had kind of all gone away?
Isn't that interesting timing? And the other thing is that the people, when they disbanded, they went to New York, to the same area where the Smiths later ended up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Although a lot of people from that area in Vermont did go to New York, but I just think that that's an interesting connection.
Absolutely. So let's continue going. We jumped back into 1798 for a second. Let's jump into the mid 1830s here in Kirtland. As the Kirtland Temple is laid, obviously there was this massive cornerstone laying ceremony. There was also a cornerstone ceremony in Adamant-Diomen when they went out to Missouri in 1837 or late 37, early 38. They had these various cornerstone laying ceremonies. Oh, also in Independence, Missouri in 1831 or 32, I believe it was. And you told me that the cornerstone laying ceremonies themselves have roots in Masonry as well. Is that accurate?
Yes. In the early days of the nations, the Masons were called to come in and lay the cornerstone of these important buildings in like Washington, D.C. and all over the country. The Masons were the ones that did the cornerstone laying ceremonies.
Kirtland was just the beginning of Mormonism's intermingling with Masonry. As Cheryl goes on to articulate the highly secretive Danites during the Missouri year of 1838, of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, it likely had Masonic roots as well. It's interwoven, Masonry is interwoven with, there couldn't help but be some kind of influence on Joseph Smith, especially when he was surrounded by so many movers and shakers in Mormonism that were Masons as well. But we don't have evidence of Joseph ever ascending to Masonry prior to 1842. So how do we get there? How do we get from these Masonic influences to Joseph Smith finally joining Masonry and installing the Nauvoo Lodge?
Well, I don't believe some people actually try to make a connection and say that Joseph Smith was a Mason before Nauvoo, and I don't believe that. I think that he did become a Mason in Nauvoo. However, with all of his knowledge of Masonry, I think that that was his preoccupation. Masonry was really he loved Masonry. It really appealed to him in many, many ways. And there's something in Masonry called a keen Mason. And that is someone who is really good at ritual. And a lot of times they'll make up these other rituals to go along with the Masonic degrees and just kind of supplement them. And at the time,
and Joseph had been practicing occult rituals his entire life. He was made for this job, right?
Yes. And so I think he was kind of a keen Mason, where he started developing rituals and Masonic-like institutions very early in Nauvoo. And I really feel that what he was doing in Missouri with the Danites was very Masonic.
Interesting.
And so I think he was experimenting with ritual quite early, even though he wasn't actually a Freemason. He knew enough about it, and he was talented enough in this area that that's what he was doing. You'll see the Danites making oaths that are so similar to Masonic oaths. And some of the things that they're involved in are just the things that society was worried that the Masons would do, that Mormons actually did bring that into being and did some of those things that people were worried about.
Let's explore that a little bit more. Because obviously the Danites were seen as an absolute aberration by the inhabitants of Missouri, who were not so friendly to the Mormons. And it was only after Dr. Samson Avard and Thomas B. Marsh essentially defected from Mormonism and gave their affidavits in Richmond that they were able to arrest Joseph Smith and get the grand jury trial in response to everything that had happened in 1838 during the Mormon War. So let's talk a little bit about what the Danites were doing and what makes or leads you to believe that it was kind of it had its roots in Masonry.
There are just so many things that are so similar to Masonry. They were given secret names, for example, that just like the Masons were given a new name. Who was it that was the son of thunder?
Isn't it Orrin Porter Rockwell's?
Son of thunder. Orrin Porter Rockwell was son of thunder, okay. And then there were several others who had these names that they were called by and were in charge of these groups of Danites. And we have Ebenezer Robinson's account. We have several, Swarthwell or someone. Sorry, I don't have my stuff right in front of me, but
there's so many names.
There's several journals which kind of described what they did when they joined the Danites. And we can kind of reconstruct what the ritual might have looked like. And it was very, very Masonic. I do a reconstruction of this ritual, what it might have looked like. There were 3 degrees to it. And there were so many things that they did that were similar. And even some of the wording is so exactly like Masonry. So it's really hard to take Masonry away from those Danites.
Obviously, especially with so many Mormon elites who were members of Masonry at this time. It just seems like they're so tightly interwoven that trying to pull them apart, you tend to lose aspects of both or either of these aspects, Mormonism and Masonry. If you try and pull them, they're so inextricably tied together. Finally, Joe escaped from Liberty Jail in spring of 1839 and sought to build his kingdom on the Mississippi from the ground up. And if you're going to build anything, Masons are there to help. Throughout all the building efforts of Nauvoo, which was a swampland when the Mormons began settling there, Masonry would slowly creep further and further into the belief system of Joseph Smith. Joe began running in circles with powerful Masons who were politicians in order to garner the necessary favors for the Mormons to peaceably settle in Illinois and Iowa. John C. Reckitt Bennett, close friend and roommate of the prophet until late spring 1842, was a Mason in addition to being quartermaster general of the Illinois State Militia. Reckitt Bennett also supplied the Nauvoo Legion with the munitions necessary to make them a proper fighting force. Bennett likely used his Masonic connections to help the Mormons lobby the state governments and pass the Nauvoo Charter during the final legislative session of 1840. Bennett was summarily elected mayor of Nauvoo and continued to elevate the Mormons' position and influence in state politics until his toxic breakup with Joseph Smith over spiritual wifery, amidst other complaints. However, it should be noted that the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge was seemingly installed under false pretenses in 1842. Masonry had suffered in Illinois from the Morgan Affair. It was still feeling the effects from it, and it was just beginning to make a revival in the state of Illinois. Grand Master Abraham Jonas was the Mason who gave the Nauvoo Lodge its charter, but the political motivations of Jonas may help add a bit more depth to the situation and the resulting controversy among Masons. So let's go ahead and get into the Nauvoo years. It took a little while for the leadership in Nauvoo to be able to get a lodge installed, partly because there was so much going on that they were building a city on a swampland that was, had zero civilization and habitation before they got there. So they were obviously quite busy, but they built this Nauvoo or this Masonic Lodge before there were a number of other public works buildings that were erected. This is at the same time that they were building the Nauvoo House, the red brick store, the temple cornerstones were laid. I mean, there was a number of things going on, but it did seem like they focused on getting this lodge built, that it was a bit of a priority. So can you kind of walk us through what became the troubles that they went through in order to get the lodge installed, and how the Nauvoo Lodge was viewed by Masons who were not part of the Mormon movement in Illinois?
Right. Well, another reason was not only that they were so busy, but just Freemasonry was just starting back up in Illinois. It had gone under. There was a Grand Lodge in Illinois early on, but it had gone under during the Morgan Affair, like a lot of lodges in the United States. And so they were just rebuilding Masonry in Illinois, barely. So they couldn't have started a lodge much earlier because there wasn't a Grand Lodge there in Illinois. And once they got the Grand Lodge started, then they began to petition to have this lodge in Nauvoo. And people were not very amenable to that. The first lodge that they petitioned, they wanted to get a recommendation, because you need to get a recommendation from another lodge in order to start a lodge. And the first lodge they petitioned was Bodley Lodge, who said, "We don't know any of you. We're not going to recommend you." And so instead of getting to know these people from Bodley Lodge, they went over their head and they went directly to the Grand Master of the lodge, who had a lot of Joseph Smith connections. He had political connections, and he kind of snuck them in. So ever since the beginning, other Masons in the state did not like the way that was done and really resisted the Mormon lodges. One thing I think is interesting is a lot of people wonder why Joseph Smith would start a Masonic lodge. And they say that, he was trying to curry favor with the rest of the Masons in the state. No, no, no. He was doing everything that would offend other Masons in the state.
Really?
He was, the people in the Masonic Lodge at Nauvoo were doing things that were not kosher in Masonry and flaunting it. And yeah, they were not currying favor with anyone. So if they had wanted to make friends through the Masonic Lodge, they did exactly the opposite.
Okay. Now, I want to dive into this because this is just really fascinating. I've never heard it said this way. So do you mind letting us in a little bit further on how you're able to conclude that? Or is there anything that you've seen that has kind of led you to speculate that Joseph was acting in almost anti-authoritarian measures when it came to other Masons? Qualify that a little bit for me. I'm extremely curious.
Okay. So let's just start at the very beginning when they had their Masonic induction ceremony, when Abraham Jonas came to install the lodge in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith, the day before, they had this installation where Jonas gave authority to the men who were going to be like the master of the lodge and all the officers. And Joseph Smith acted as the grand chaplain. Not only just chaplain, he was acting as grand chaplain, which is a position just like way over his head, and he wasn't even a Mason yet. So, yeah, so he didn't become a Mason until the next day.
But I mean, to be fair, he also called himself Lieutenant General and, all of these other things that he never actually spent any time. So it didn't seem like he had a problem calling himself authority figures or just seizing authority.
No, but if you are a Mason, though, and you see that, you're going, what is he doing?
Yeah, of course.
And then Abraham Jonas made him and Sidney Rigdon Masons on 2 separate days. They got all the 3 degrees. And usually you have to get 1 degree and then go like a month and learn, several things and then get another degree. And it usually takes you, several months to get your Master Mason's degree. But they got it immediately. And so that's another thing. People were going, what's that all about? What's so special about them that they would give them these degrees in two days?
So let me ask, and this may be speculation, because I think it's called this on-site ascendancy, right? Where somebody just is like made a Mason on site.
There is something called being made a Mason at site.
Okay.
And this is something that the Grand Master has the authority to do. The master of the Grand Lodge can come in and make someone a Mason at site. However, it's a little bit different than what he was doing with Joseph and Sidney. There are several different procedures they have to do. Like he has to open a Grand Lodge and, he does it all right away. He doesn't like have the degrees over 2 days. So it was just a little bit different than making a Mason at site. It was not something that was done regularly.
And I know that it was extremely, it was honorary if you are made a Mason at site, right? I mean, it's somebody who is seen as an extremely respectable individual in society, and somebody who would qualify as a good Master Mason, that they were able to get this honorary on site or at site ascendancy. But it sounds like from the way that Joseph was acting, the way you're describing, almost flaunting what he was doing to other Masons, that it was kind of just more up to this Grand Master Jonas, who said, yeah, you are now fully ascended after 2 days. And I can understand how, dues paying Masons might be extremely offended at this guy, Grand Master Jonas, just coming in and ascending Joseph and Sidney Rigdon after he didn't pay his dues, after he didn't go through the proper ascendancy rituals over the amount of time, after he didn't spend his time as a fellow craft and then as a secondary degree and 3rd degree finally. I can see that's frustrating.
It is. And the other thing was, though, then they started doing this with all the rest of the Masons in Nauvoo. You're only supposed to do like 3 degrees at a time. Only 3 men can get a degree at a time. So to get around that, what they did was they'd have a lodge in the morning, open the lodge in the morning, give 3 men a degree, open the lodge in the afternoon, give 3 more men a degree, open the lodge in the evening, and give another 3. So they're doing 9 a day. Well, most more Masonic lodges meet once a month, so they can do 3 a month.
Right.
Well, these guys would do 3 a day, and then they'd meet again the next day, and the next day, and the next day. So they made so many Masons that very early on, by the 1st year, they had surpassed the number of Masons in all the other lodges in Illinois.
Wow.
So they had completely overrun the Masonic institution there. They had the most Masons in any other lodge. And then they started opening up other lodges in Iowa, other lodges in Nauvoo. And so you can see why that would be threatening.
This is a very confusing time in early Mormonism. And This may be forcing you to speculate a little bit, but do you think the Grand Master Jonas was just trying to gain favor of Joseph Smith and the Mormons, or what do you think his motivations were behind ascending Joseph and Sidney in a matter of 2 days?
Well, first of all, he may have been politically motivated. Mervyn Hogan thinks that he wanted the Mormon vote, and so he was a politician, and he may have done that. But also, Abraham Jonas was Jewish, and so that was interesting too. He may have had an affinity for a different, religious tradition. There weren't very many Masons who were Jewish, and so he may have felt for them because they were religiously persecuted. The other thing was that at the time in the United States, there was talk of having a national Grand Lodge, which would be over all of the Grand Lodges in the United States. He may have wanted to build the Illinois Grand Lodge so that they could have influence in this national Grand Lodge. And so he saw that Joseph Smith could bring in all these Masons to Illinois. He'd build up Masonry in Illinois, and then he'd be well known.
Okay. So I guess you don't need a further explanation than he was trying to gain political favors, but I think it is still kind of interesting to kind of speculate on and consider where the motivations may have been, even if they are speculative.
I do have another little tidbit about Jonas. He was married to a woman who was a sister of, what was the first name of Seixas?
Oh, Joshua Seixas.
Joshua Seixas, yeah. And so there was a Mormon connection there too, that he was the brother-in-law of Joshua Seixas, who was there teaching them Hebrew.
Yeah, and just to qualify that was in the School of the Prophets from 1835 to 36. That's when Joshua Seixas was hired by the Mormons in order to come and teach them Hebrew. Is that correct?
Right. That's right.
Joseph Smith could take multiple disparate fields of philosophy and mingle them together in a way which properly comported with his own personal belief system. Joseph was able to gather information from multiple unrelated sects of religion and philosophy and smash them into some kind of a coherent narrative in his own mind. Masonry served to be the fountainhead for Joe to continually come into contact with people of all schools of thought, and after multiple conversations would eventually evolve his own belief system to accommodate their rational argumentation, to which he was frequently exposed. Historians have claimed that the LDS Temple Endowment ceremony wasn't based on Masonry, and that the similarities aren't coincidental but superficial. The timing of Joseph revealing the endowment ceremony a mere 7 weeks after he ascended to Master Mason needs to remain a consideration in attempting to ascribe causal links between Mason and Mormon rituals. Fawn Brody argued in No Man Knows My History on page 279 as follows, quote, "The Mormon Temple Endowment ceremony is without a doubt taken from the Masonic ceremonies Joseph Smith participated in just weeks before he introduced the Temple Endowment. The grips, tokens, covenants, secret words, keys, etc. were word for word the same when first introduced. Members who were Masons previous to Joseph joining the fraternal order unashamedly referred to the Mormon Endowment as Celestial Masonry." End quote. Mervyn Hogan, in his 1991 book, Freemasonry and Mormon Ritual, articulated the causal link between the rituals as well when he said the following, quote, "Little room for doubt can exist in the mind of an informed, objective analyst that the Mormon Temple Endowment and the rituals of ancient craft masonry are seemingly intimately and definitely involved." End quote. A contemporary account lends some insight into Joseph's mentality behind appropriating the Masonic rituals for the Temple Endowment ceremony. In a letter from Heber the Creeper Kimball to P-Cubed Parley P. Pratt, he said the following, quote, "Brother Joseph says Masonry was taken from the priesthood but has become degenerated, but many things are perfect." End quote. It seems from this prevalence of information that Joseph had an idea that the Masonic ritual did indeed descend from Solomon's Temple, or maybe even from ancient Egypt, as many Masons believed in his day, and that his adjusted version of the ritual was merely restoring it to its perfect form. There's a certain fascination held by Joe and the other elders with these ancient rituals and the mysteries which they frequently employed during said rituals. There are many differences between Masonic ascendancy rituals and Joseph's endowment ceremony, but we can't ignore the similarities, especially given the timing. This is a large subject, and dozens of historians have articulated this point better than I ever could. But let's review the similarities we see between the Josephite endowment ceremony and the common iterations of the Masonic ascendancy ritual contemporary with Joseph's ministry. The similarities in the ritual were compiled on mormonismi.net, and you'll find a link to this article in the show notes. This is where we're actually talking about the rituals themselves. So if you don't want to hear about them for any reason, skip the next few minutes, probably about 10 minutes, and come back and we'll talk about it later in the conclusion. This is not exhaustive, and certain variations exist depending on which rite of Masonry and which era of Mormon temple ritual we're discussing, but this list will at least get us familiar with some of the overt similarities. So let's begin. There's the Masonic preparation room and the Mormon dressing room, in which the person, the candidate for Masonic ascendancy or for the Mormon endowment, comes in, they get dressed, they are washed, and they have these dressing rooms, and where it says in the Mormon dressing room, the people are divested of all of their clothing, they await a bath with the special inner garments over his shoulder. And of course, these are the original Josephite endowment ceremonies. So we also have the Masonic compass and the Mormon compass. And you see the Mormon compass on the garments, and the compass is over the left breast, sewn into the garments. We have the Masonic square as well, and on the Mormon garments, the Masonic square is on the right breast. We have the Masonic washing ceremony and the Mormon washing ceremony, which was actually removed, from my understanding, in the 1990s. According to the Masonic ceremony, the master orders the basin of the perfumed water and a clean napkin to be brought to him, and he directs the candidate to wash his hands, which he does. Master takes a box of perfumed ointment and anoints the candidate on the head, their eyes, their mouth, their heart, the tips of his right ear, hand, foot, and says, "You are now, my dear brother, received a member of our society." According to the Mormon washing ceremony of Joseph era, as a candidate is washed, the official hurries through the lustration ritual. The candidate is passed on to another attendant and is anointed with oil. The oil is very definitely applied to various organs of the body, in different places than the Masonic ritual, but still the anointing happens. Then we have Masons presenting a new name to the candidate. And of course, Mormon temple workers present a new name to the candidate. Every time a Mormon goes through the temple ritual, they get a new name, basically. The first time you go through, it's your own temple name, and every time you do that do the ceremonies afterwards, you are doing it for people who have passed on. Then we have a man representing Adam in the Masonic ceremony, and then also a man representing Adam in the Mormon ceremony. And this is where this passion narrative comes in. Masonic has their own passion narrative and involved with Hiram Abiff and an entire story behind that, whereas the Mormon ceremony involves the Genesis story, essentially. And we have a man representing Adam, and then next we also have a man representing deity in the Masonic ceremony as well as in the Mormon ceremony. We also have the Masons used a mallet. He raps on the podium with the mallet. It's a common gavel or a mallet, and in the Mormon temple ritual, a temple worker gives 3 raps on the mallet as well. Now, I'm just going to reiterate as we continue through this, the Josephite ceremony, endowment ceremony, is different than how it is practiced in the Brighamite Church today. The Masonic rituals vary widely among all of the different rites and the different versions of Masonry, and there are differences and similarities. So this that we're describing here is the Josephite ceremony, when he first revealed it in 1842. Moving on, we have the Masonic penalty sign, and this is made from the dugard by dropping the left hand carelessly at the same time, raising the right arm, and you draw the hand still open across the throat with your thumb next to your throat, and then drop the hand perpendicular to the side. You basically symbolize a cutting of your own throat, and this is done in a vow of secrecy that if you reveal these signs, then you will take your own life. And of course, the Mormon penalty sign is much the same. There's also the Masonic grip. There are a number of different grips. There are in Masonry various grips. In Mormonism, there are 3 separate grips. There is the Masonic wording concerning the grip. So this is how the Masons do they exchange the grips. We have the master and candidate holding each other by the grip. As before described, the master says, "What is this?" The answer says, "A grip." A grip of what? The grip of an entered apprentice Mason. Has it a name? It has. Will you give it to me? I did not so receive it, neither can I so impart it. And then, of course, with the Mormon wording concerning what their handshake is, we have Peter asking, what is that? And then we have Adam saying, this is the first token of the Aaronic priesthood, instead of saying this is the grip of an entered apprentice. Then Peter says, has it a name? Adam says, it has. Peter, will you give it to me? Adam, I cannot, for it is connected with my new name, but this is the sign. Moving on, we have the Masonic oath and the Mormon oath. This is essentially what was co-opted as the blood oath in the Mormon temple ceremonies once Brigham Young took over but Brigham created his own Brighamite church and moved the Mormons out to Utah when he properly instated the blood oath. Blood atonement oath, I should say. So the Masonic oath goes as follows: binding myself under no less penalty than to have my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by the roots. And then the Mormon oath is, we and each of us covenant and promise that we will not reveal any secrets of this. Should we do so, we agree that our throats be cut from ear to ear and our tongues torn out by their roots. All of these extremely similar or word for word verbatim plagiarisms from the Masonic ceremonies are used in the original Mormon Temple Endowment ceremonies and largely exist in the same form in the current endowment ceremonies. Now we have the Masonic fellowcraft versus the second token of the Aaronic priesthood. So earlier we were just going through the first token. This is the entered apprentice. Next is the fellowcraft. This is the Masonic oath of the fellowcraft, and as opposed to the Aaronic priesthood. Binding myself under no less penalty than to have my left breast torn open and my heart and vitals taken from thence and thrown over my shoulder. Then the Mormon oath is, we and each of us do covenant and promise that we will not reveal the secrets of this. Should we do so, we agree to have our breasts cut open and our hearts and vitals torn from our bodies. Exact same words. We have the Masonic penalty sign that is attached to this second degree. The sign is given by drawing your right hand flat with the palm of it next to your breast and from the left to the right side with some quickness and dropping it down by your side. Basically, symbolizing cutting yourself across the gut. A Mormon penalty sign, of course, is exactly the same. Then we have the Masonic grip for the entered apprentice, which you take each other's hands and grip the first knuckle. The first and second knuckles of the other person's right hand. The Mormon grip is exactly the same. Then we have the Masonic name given, where it says, brother, I now present you with my right hand in token of brotherly love and confidence, and with it the pass grip and word of fellowcraft Mason. The name of it is Shibboleth. The Mormon name is given, the name is given the name of the candidate who is going through the ritual. Then we have the Masonic master sign versus the first and second token of the Melchizedek priesthood. The Masonic sign is given by raising both hands and arms to the elbows perpendicular, one each side of the head, with the elbows forming a square. The Mormon sign is made by bringing both hands to the square with the palms to the front, so extremely similar. And of course, in this article, you will see small illustrations of each of these signs and tokens and the handshakes as they are given. Then we have the Masonic penalty and the Mormon penalty sign, which is issued in attachment to the Master Mason and the first and second token of the Melchizedek priesthood. The Masonic penalty sign is, the penal sign is given by putting the right hand to the left side of the bowels and the hand open with the thumb next to the belly and letting it fall. This is done tolerably quick. And the Mormon penalty sign is much the same. Then the third oath is under Masonry. It is binding myself under no less penalty than to have my body severed into in the midst. And then the Mormon oath is, should we do so, we agree that our bodies be cut asunder in the midst and all our bowels gush out. And then we have the final Masonic grip. This is grasp each other's right hands firmly, the spaces between the thumb and first finger being interlocked, and the tops of the fingers being pressed hard against each other's wrist where it joins the hand, the fingers of each being somewhat spread. And this is also, the Mormon grip is actually made of grasp just using the first finger on the wrist, and that's known as the sure sign of the nail, of course. Then we have the Masonic grand hailing sign and due guard. So this sign is given by raising both hands and arms to the elbow perpendicularly, one on each side of the head, and the elbows forming a square. The due guard is made by holding both hands in front with the palms down. The Mormon endowment ritual is the Pele Ale. The sign is made by elevating both arms above the head to the square, and then the arms are dropped down to the sides. Now we also have the Masonic and the Mormon apron, extremely similar. Then we have the Masonic raising of Hiram Abiff versus the Mormon veil. And that's where we come into the 5 points of fellowship. Now, the 5 points of fellowship, this was something that was practiced in the original endowment ceremony. This is something that no longer is practiced in the Mormon endowment ceremony. Essentially, we have what the 5 points are is foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, hand to back, and ear to mouth. And that's how it was practiced in the 5 points as a person was passing through the veil in the Mormon endowment ceremony. Then we have a master mason raising the candidate. The master, in raising him, is assisted by some of the brethren who take hold of the candidate by the arms and shoulders. As soon as he is raised to his feet, they step back, and the master whispers the word, the password, in his ear and causes the candidate to repeat it, telling him that he must never give it in any manner other than that in which he receives it. He is told that the sign signifies marrow in the bone, and then they separate. And of course, the Mormon version of passing through the veil, you give the 5 points of fellowship, and then it says, one putting his mouth to the other's ear, in which position the Lord whispers, Lord, this is the sign of the token. Health to the navel, marrow to the bones, strength in the loins and sinews, and power in the priesthood be upon me and my posterity through all generations of time and through all eternity. And that is it. That is the very basic rundown of a comparison between the Masonic ascendancy ritual through which Joseph Smith passed in 1842 and the Mormon endowment ceremony, which he introduced a mere 7 weeks after he passed through that Masonic ascendancy ritual. The similarities don't stop at just the rituals themselves. Mormon temples are covered in Masonic symbolism. And what is interesting here is we can chart the Masonic influence in Mormonism by simply comparing the architecture of the Kirtland Temple, dedicated in 1836, to that of the Nauvoo Temple, dedicated after Joseph Smith's death in 44, but it was planned and largely constructed during his lifetime. The Kirtland Temple includes very few, if any, architectural Masonic symbols. However, the Nauvoo Temple is covered with moon phases and moon-shaped windows, sunstones, handshakes, the all-seeing eye, beehives, and a number of other not-so-subtle allusions to Masonry. Even the original weather vane for the Nauvoo Temple wasn't the angel Moroni, but an angel flying horizontally with a trumpet in one hand, wearing a Masonic robe, and with a small Masonic square and compass at the bottom of the weather vane. Now, the Salt Lake City Temple is a whole other game. It is the keystone of Mormon Masonry. The symbology is everywhere. And what's interesting, too, is the original plans had even more Masonic symbolism than the actual structure as it stands today. Some of the items were removed during construction phases for various reasons. Initially, the windows themselves were supposed to be bordered by a compass and a square, but the plans didn't make it into the construction, and that was likely due to cost. There's also these alcoves beside the doors, and they carry the 2 busts of Joseph and Hiram Smith, and those are also Masonic. And Masonry, typically alcoves on either sides of doors, housed busts of John the Baptist and John the Revelator on either side of the door. There's also the Star of David, appears in a lot of Masonic art, and most Mormon temples have multiple stars or Stars of David in the stone or in the windows or somewhere. There's also the Big Dipper on the Salt Lake Temple. I mean, Masonry is simply everywhere in Mormonism. The thing is, Masonry in Mormonism is treated very differently today than when the first ceremonies were first introduced into Mormon doctrine. The modern church doesn't actively divorce itself from Masonry, but it surely isn't regularly discussed by any stretch of imagination. The early Mormons were open about it. Many of them, like Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Parley P. Pratt, they all knew that Joseph restored the ancient mysteries to true form from which they had been largely preserved by Masonry since the Temple of Solomon. It doesn't seem like they thought that Joseph lifted the ceremony straight from Masonry. It seems more as if they were fully aware of the Masonic rites and thought that the Mormon Temple Endowment was merely a purified form of those rites, and they had no reason to hide it. Brigham Young called the endowment ceremony celestial masonry. Heber C. Kimball said, quote, "We have the true masonry. The masonry of today is received from the apostasy which took place in the days of Solomon and David. They have now and then a little thing that is correct, but we have the real thing," end quote. The wealth of similarities and the coinciding timing from when Joseph ascended to Master Mason and then the endowment ceremonies being introduced seem to point to genetic contribution from Masonry to the Mormon endowment ceremony. But is one truly derived from the other? Quinn seems to argue in opposition to this in his book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. This is beginning on page 226. Quote, Mormon officials and scholars generally agree that Mormonism reached its doctrinal apex in 1842-44 in Nauvoo, when Smith gave instructions about the Temple Endowment. Some interpreters, both non-Mormons and Mormons, have described the endowment as borrowed directly from contemporary Freemasonry. Although there are superficial similarities of symbol and rite between Masonic rituals and the Mormon endowment, I believe that the underlying philosophy and purpose of the two were fundamentally different. Mormon revelation, in fact, proclaimed that the LDS endowment directly restored what Masonry acknowledged it had only some connection with, the occult mysteries of the ancient world. End quote. Then Quinn goes on to summarize what these mysteries of the ancient world are in language contemporary with Joseph Smith. Quote, From Smith's time to the present, these ancient mysteries have been viewed as the climax of the occult tradition and magic worldview. In 1790, a book repeatedly stated that, quote, the mysteries occultly signified, end quote, various meanings. New York's Lutheran president observed in 1810, quote, the mysteries were not only a great support to magic, but they also gave to it a new and more shining appearance, end quote. An 1817 study of the Eleusinian mysteries commented, quote, if it were possible to lift the veil which covers the mysteries of Eleusis, we should possess a key to the mysteries of Egypt and the East, end quote. Under the heading of The Exercise of Occult Power, a multi-volume encyclopedia included the ancient mysteries and necromancy. Maurice Boyson wrote a generation ago that, quote, it was in the mysteries that sympathetic magic achieved its full development, end quote. And then Quinn goes on to quote from The Messenger and Advocate, which was the church periodical in 1837, where it speaks directly of the Eleusinian mysteries. Quote, Ereuthus, who cultivated the plains of Eleusis, instituted the Eleusinian mysteries. These mysteries were of a religious and moral nature, conveying the doctrines and the unity of God, the immortality of the soul, and a future state of reward and punishment. Cicero speaks of them in high commendation, but the ceremonies connected with them were childish and ridiculous, end quote. And then after that, in order to explain everything and why this fascination, Quinn goes on to quote Hugh Nibley to explain why we find such direct influence of these old mysteries and a never-ending pursuit of them in early Mormon theology and practice, when Hugh Nibley said this, quote, in the early days of the church, the mysteries of the past intrigued and aroused the brethren, end quote. No matter how hard we try, we're never going to be able to actually insert ourselves into Joseph Smith's shoes. We're never going to be able to see the world the way that Joseph Smith did. But it's fun to just pick up on these little things, little aspects of his life, whether it was in Masonry or his military commands. Just fill in the blank with anything that Joseph Smith did and try and understand why he would have done what he did, even if we're just using our speculation based on what we have seen in the historical record in order to come to those conclusions. But I still think some historians, some people may think that it's an exercise in futility trying to understand Joseph's motivations. But I think if we don't try and speculate and try and understand those things, then the historical models are somehow a little out of touch with reality if we can't understand why somebody wanted to do what they did.
Exactly. I think the more you learn about Masonry, the more you can understand these motivations and what were they doing in Nauvoo with Masonry. And otherwise, things just don't make sense.
Absolutely.
So it's really great to just go back and look at all these historical details and try to see what was behind all of this.
So, Cheryl, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been wildly mind-opening. You're extremely informative, and I want to personally thank you so much. Do you happen to have a working title for the book, and when can we look out for that to be on the shelves?
Yes, our title is Method Infinite, and it comes from a quote by Eliza R. Snow, who says, "There's method in Mormonism, method infinite. Mormonism is Masonic.
Out of all of the people that you could have quoted or based a book title on, I think Eliza Snow must be up there in the top 5 of the most amazing people. I just absolutely love Eliza Snow. I think that's a brilliant title. Very nicely done.
She is awesome.
She is so fascinating, and I find that she is much like Joseph Smith. The deeper you dig into her, you find there are just so many more folds and so much more to her than initially meets the eye. So when can we expect to possibly see this book on the shelves?
Well, we're hoping to have the writing finished by August. I'm not exactly sure how long it'll take to edit, but Copeford Publishing is putting it out.
Fantastic. So let's just hedge a conservative guess that hopefully spring to summertime 2019, and I thoroughly look forward to seeing that book. This is really going to be interesting. If it's anything like what you've shared with us today, and it dives deeper into some of the concepts and broader subjects we've discussed today, I'm sure that a number of our listeners who enjoy this information will be looking forward to it as much as I am. So Cheryl, once again, thank you so much. Is there anywhere that you'd like to give to the listeners if they'd like to reach out to you or if they want further information on this?
Oh, I'm around on Facebook.
Awesome. And that's Cheryl, Cheryl Bruno, Bruno.
That's right.
Awesome. So thank you once again, Cheryl. This has really been a pleasure.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
We'll never be able to get inside Joseph Smith's head. Whatever Mormonism was from 1830 to 1844 under Joe, in his mind, it was a coherent and fluid system of religious beliefs that could adapt and evolve, dependent on whatever Joe happened to be exposed to at any given time. If Joseph Smith plagiarized Masonic rituals for his endowment ceremony, does that somehow invalidate Mormonism as the one true religion? But for Mormons, this could be a challenge to reconcile. As the one true gospel on earth, belief in Mormonism hinges on the claim that Joseph was the prophet who spoke directly to God to restore the one true religion. How can the one true religion be plagiarized from other religions? Or in Masonry's case, non-religions. But a loophole exists here. Other religions have pieces of truth, but Mormonism has the full and complete truth. Seeing so many religions and philosophies from which Mormonism incontrovertibly descended, there's no reason to view Mormonism different from any other religion. You take a little Protestant Christianity and a healthy dose of universalism, you mix in some Baptist communalism, add post-Enlightenment occultism partway through the mixing process, you pass it all through the mill of Masonry, you bake it at 451 Fahrenheit for 33 years, you season the whole thing with a little bit of Swedenborgianism and a pinch of Rosicrucianism, divide it into 12 equal portions and serve with a moderate helping of Kabbalah, and you've got a brand new religion, and the whole is somehow greater than the sum of the constituent parts. Mormonism isn't original. Unique, yes, but original? Exhibit one belief that Joseph sincerely held and taught as doctrine, which had never been practiced before in some form, you still wouldn't prove that he was original. Joseph merely synthesized and called it restoring the original. Even then, even if we can prove that some of Joseph's doctrines were indeed original, we're still a long way off from proving that he's a true prophet of God. Whatever it is that means. Do I dare make the bold assertion that there's no such thing as an original religion? Religions evolve organically from the fertile soil from which they spring, but I've yet to see a single religion which truly arose from a spiritual and philosophical vacuum. Religions come from other religions. They influence and descend from each other. Some gain more traction than others. Some die out with a few sparse believers. Some take over massive swaths of land and resources. Others are too exclusive to allow more than a few families to be followers. Not all religions are equal, but they're all religions. And I can't wrap my mind around treating Mormonism different than any other Protestant sect when viewing it with the lens of a religious historian. So if we can explicitly describe the philosophies and religions which Mormonism evolved from, does that make it any less true? Well, would the inverse of that question nullify that proposition? Let's try it. If we can explicitly show that Mormonism didn't evolve from other religions and philosophy which existed prior to Joseph Smith publishing the Book of Mormon, does that make Mormonism true? Believing members who are unaware of everything presented today, who are nonetheless critical thinkers, may have some serious issues knowing that they go to the temple to perform a largely Masonic ritual. If a person is basing their belief in Mormonism on the originality of the doctrine or the antiquity of the Book of Mormon, it's understandable how this information may force them to take pause and re-examine what it is they believe. They can just, walk away. Say that Joe made it all up based on what was around him. That seems like a perfectly rational conclusion. They can compartmentalize and let their faith go on preserved in its ignorant form and put all this information up on their ever-creaking shelf. Or they can truly emulate the founding prophet Joseph Smith and evolve and adapt their belief system to incorporate Joseph's Masonry. Whatever the decision, it is never worth it to sacrifice one's own critical thinking and rationality for untenable religious beliefs. That will do it for a mere scratching of the surface of Mormonism and Masonry. There is so much here. I know I missed things. I know I left out a lot of details. This was incredibly dense, and the amount of time that I devoted to researching this is woefully lacking compared to what an actual Masonic historian would have devoted, or an actual Mormon historian who's studying Masonry would have devoted to this. I didn't have decades to devote to this. It was a couple weeks of researching it. So I hope you'll pardon any inaccuracies, and I hope if there are any glaring inaccuracies, you guys will reach out to me at nakedmormonism@gmail.com. I'd love to hear corrections and issue corrections on the next episode. This is just the beginning of Masonry and Mormonism. We're going to continue to interweave it into the historical timeline as we go. Have a couple of announcements real quick. I told you guys about the Satanic Temple presentation that I did with Braden, a soon-to-be co-host of mine. We'll talk about that in a second. That was on Mormon Satan, the brother of Jesus. That video is now up on YouTube. You can find it on the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel, or just by searching Mormon Satan, the brother of Jesus, and you'll find it there. It was a 1-hour presentation. It was a lot of fun. So another couple of projects that I'm finally able to talk about now. The Protect LDS Children movement has now published on their YouTube channel a documentary that I have been putting a number of hours into, and I would really enjoy it if you guys went over and gave that a watch and gave it a share, because it is stock full of a lot of information that really needs to get out there. It's a very brief rundown of everything that you need to know on the Protect LDS Children campaign and the movement, and hopefully offers a shareable little snippet, a mini documentary for people who are completely unfamiliar with the movement to see what is there and understand kind of the scope and breadth of this issue and the goals behind the campaign. So I encourage listeners to go check out the Protect LDS Children YouTube channel. You can find it in the show notes. You can find a link to that video specifically in the show notes, or just by searching Proper Channels Documentary. Also, one more big announcement. This is finally debuting a project that I have been working on with a couple of collaborators for a number of months now. We are in the process of rebooting the Glassbox podcast. This is a project that I started a long time ago that unfortunately didn't really take off because of lack of interest and involvement, and this is hopefully going to be the next evolution of the Glassbox podcast, and we are going to reboot it. So what we are doing is debuting a link for our patrons, for the patrons of Naked Mormonism. You're going to find an email on April 26th, 2018 on your Patreon inbox, whatever inbox or email address you use to subscribe to patreon.com/nakedmormonism, that will be a link to a Google Drive folder where we have our first set of episodes. We have gone through a lot of trial recording, a lot of playing with how we want to do this, and Braden and I are kind of working on this, and we would like to get some feedback. We'd like to hear what you guys think. Basically, we are doing some really deep Mormon doctrine dives, and it's turning out really fun. If you are a Patreon subscriber, you're going to get those debut episodes before they actually air on the Glassbox podcast feed next month, and we will keep everybody updated as it continues to progress from there. You'll also find in that same Google Drive the outtakes folder, which is just a little something extra, a little bit of fun for you guys if you want to listen to some bloopers in the recording room. So just letting everybody know, the Satanic Temple video, the Protect LDS Children mini documentary, and the new podcast that Braden Ham and I are working on that is going to be debuting in the middle of May. Please check all of that out. Check the show notes for links to everything, and check your inbox. If you are a subscriber on patreon.com, you'll get access to that new podcast before it goes out to the general public. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. I hope this has been a bit of a precursor on what the future holds for us with Masonry, and I sincerely thank you so much for listening to this very long episode 100. I know that you guys really like these long format episodes as opposed to how the format is usually tailored. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Natalie Newell as production assistant, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is provided by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.